At the time of the Iraq War, there were 176 newspapers worldwide owned by Rupert Murdoch. 175 of them supported the invasion of Iraq. The Western Samoa Sun, the editor of the the ex-editor of the Western Samoa Sun, did not support the war in Iraq. Now, the opposition might claim that that is coincidence, and that shows, I think, a rather glossy view of life, almost as if global warming wasn't happening or something. But let's be in no doubt, because on a 50-50 basis, the mathematicians here will tell you that the probability of that happening by coincidence is remote. The other point to recognise, and this has been a theme from all the speeches on the other side, is that this is not about this side wanting to stop partisanship. We need a partisan, raucous press. This is about competition, so that there are more partisan newspapers doing their utmost to disturb the status quo and hold the powerful to account. There is no fundamental right to own something, I say to I think the last speaker from the floor on the other side. There are some fundamental rights, the right not to be tortured. Now, I don't know what he enjoys doing, but I would say that if I had to choose to order fundamental rights, the right to own a significant part of one country's newspaper, or indeed media, given cross-media ownership, I wouldn't put up there. I'd say, yes, one has a right to have a business, but there are other rights that the state, in a democratic country, through its parliament, must be able to decide, must be protected against the abuses of power. And the abuses of power, so in my spare time, I'm an international board member, a trustee of Article 19, which campaigns for press freedom worldwide. And they are appalled at what the Daily Mail and Murdoch stable claim are assaults on free speech in this country. We had our last meeting in Mexico, where journalists are kidnapped, tortured and killed by non-state agents, but with impunity from state action. We've got a meeting coming up next month in Kenya, where ownership is a big issue. And if you look at some of these countries across the world, the reason that their democracy suffers is because they don't have the multitude of partisan newspapers supporting the holding of account of the powerful. It's only been mentioned once, in a moment, only been mentioned once, but two critical words of a man in this debate, and it's not Rupert Murdoch, it's Silvio Berlusconi, where one man who was in power also controlled a huge proportion of the media, and that nearly destroyed Italian democracy, which had enough trouble on its own.
You were talking about how the Kenyan authorities maybe aren't scared enough of their press. We've heard from your side how very scared Cameron and indeed Labour politicians are of the press. Isn't it important that we have these powerful institutions that can challenge? Maybe if we had a Mexican conglomerate that stood up for its journalists, the politicians would do more to protect them.
I don't think that's right. I think you've got it the wrong way round. The problem with overweening power of people like Rupert Murdoch, who has ready access to Downing Street, albeit he doesn't have the guts to go in the front door, but it emerged that he was going in the back door, and this is not a euphemism, even though I think many of our modern day politicians wouldn't mind, is that because he had that power, okay, they wanted to suck up to him, and it is because of that power invested in an individual visitor to those political cabals that undermines democracy. In fact, this is the danger of media concentration. You get a sense of impunity for a start, because as Alan Rusbridger explained, if newspapers don't see it in their interest to promote and to hold their own industry to account, there is effectively impunity, and we've seen the damage that that has caused. The phone hacking business, I mean, listening to messages, sometimes bad, the phone of a murdered schoolgirl and their family. But what was worse, as far as we were concerned, was the suborning of the police the suborning of the police the corruption of the police by this, which you wouldn't expect to see in a civilized democracy, which was not called out until after years of effort by The Guardian and the New York Times, the suborning of politicians who are quite happy to give another chunk of our media to Rupert Murdoch because of the fear of him turning against them, the hegemony that stifles free speech. You know, I can refer to Western Samoa, but if you just look, whatever you think of Jeremy Corbyn, and I'm not a supporter of his party, the idea that if you just do the research, the idea that Isabel wants to tell us that journalists write what's come to them, how come it's never come to a single journalist on tabloids like The Times, The Daily Mail, The Sun, The Express, The Telegraph, to write a single positive article about a man who, whatever you think of his and his views, at least is a little different. Not a single article, and hundreds on the other side. I'll just make a bit more progress if I may. I think I was lucky, given that Tim is a friend of Mia, to have escaped with just what she described hacked off as, but she got the quote wrong. What the Daily Mail described us as newspaper-hating zealots, and that's certainly not true. So although Tim said that, what did he say about the mercifully defunct News of the World? Well, I don't think the News of the World should have closed. It did a lot of good work. There were good journalists on that newspaper. The thing about media empires is that no one's held accountable. Murdoch's still there, James Murdoch's still there. Rebecca Brooks, whose defence against criminality was, I was too incompetent to stop my company losing £300 million in legal costs, to stop huge numbers of my newspaper sources, breaking the first rule of ethical journalism, too incompetent to stop shopping scores of journalist sources and indeed the journalists that were paying those public officials. I was incompetent. Acquit me, please. And the jury were persuaded. She's very persuasive. And while she's entitled to her acquittal, is she entitled to a £16 million payoff and her job back when she sacrificed the jobs of hundreds of journalists and other staff on the News of the World? This is not about saying who runs what company. It's about ownership. And there are ownership rules in the world. So, Mia, I'd assure you that it's not impossible. If it was impossible, there wouldn't be a massive multi-million-pound campaign against restrictions on cross-media ownership, whether it be in this country, in other countries that I've talked about, including in Italy, or at the European Union level, or indeed at the UN level. It's also the idea that it's a vague term. In British company law, you know who owns a company. So you can't say that, oh, because a company is diffuse, there's lots of outlets, there's lots of different stores of Marks and Spencer, you don't really know who owns Marks and Spencer stores. It's very simple to be done. It really is. It's difficult to do politically for the reasons I've given. Now, the gentleman in the blue shirt, you remember the one who had the BBC fed into his room the whole time, who can't find his remote control to switch it off. I say to him that the BBC does not have government influence on its output. The alternative to public service broadcast like the BBC is Fox News. Okay? Now you can choose Fox News or the BBC. And the thing about the BBC is when the BBC screwed up, as it did on Savile, what happened? Did the top guy resign? Yes, he did. The Director General lost his job, George Entwistle. You never see that in any of the other media empires when these things happen. Isabel, the point of information that you rejected was when you said The Guardian had 234,000 readers. 8 million readers, The Guardian. Now, when your book sells 234,000 copies, then I think you're in a position... Now, it shouldn't require a marine biologist or whatever he was to criticise the view that minnows can't do anything. News Corporation was a minnow. You don't get your soon-to-be employer, the Daily Mail Group, was once a minnow. I think it was before its sort of pro-Nazi days, but it was a minnow sometime in the past. But it's allowed to be forgiven for that. All these entities were minnows once, and that's why entrepreneurship is so important. And the idea that you can't start off small So many political movements, from the suffragettes to the gay rights movement, would be dismissed by saying, you'll never get into power, okay? What's the point of voting SNP? They'll never have any influence. You need to vote for one of the two big parties. I accept the Liberal Democrats are the exception that proved me wrong, but I'll gloss over that. The Sun newspaper, because I was just amazed. I like Isabel, I think she's a fine journalist, but in terms of debating, to argue that the MP's expenses scandal showed you need large newspapers to take it on, the MP's expenses tape was rejected by the Sun, and it was rejected by the Times, not because they couldn't afford the however much it was being sold to them for, and someone would have bought it if the Telegraph didn't, but because the seller did not want them to pick only on the Labour MPs. And those newspapers said, we just want to pick on the Labour MPs. And the seller, and this is known, said no. And the Telegraph, to its credit, said it would treat, duck houses of Tories the same way as it treated expenses of Labour MPs. So I can tell you, do not rely, whenever someone advocating for the press raises MPs' expenses, it's usually a red herring. And the Sun doesn't care about tax evasion. It didn't care about LGBT rights. So yes, it sees a populist campaign on George Osborne, who wouldn't. But what it's done, if you saw yesterday's paper, was, for example, stigmatise HIV all over again. It's hugely depressing to those of us who've worked in this field. And it's allowed to do that. There's no regulation that stops it. But you would have thought that if there was more competition in the media, then someone in the media would hold it to account. I'll just finish on this point, that normally when competition damages countries, it damages consumers. And of course, yes, it does damage consumers because quality drops and there can be price fixes. But when it comes to the media and freedom of expression, what is critical is that it damages democracy, because it reduces the plurality of voices, raucous partisan voices. You're only hearing a much more limited number, and it suppresses the ability of entrepreneurs, the minnows, to break through. What's great about responsible capitalism is that there is space for those other views, there is space for those new businesses, and so what we're talking about is not only safeguarding democracy, but safeguarding modern capitalism. Please support the motion.